the astronaut is only the most visible member of a very large team. And even though a mission's commander is the authority in space, the dangerous job of spaceflight could not be accomplished without the flight control team on the ground, all led by the flight director. The one man most directly responsible for establishing the concept of mission control was the very first flight director, a man by the name of Christopher Columbus Kraft, Jr. Born on February 28, 1924, in Phobos, Virginia, Kraft graduated Virginia Tech at the young age of 20 with a bachelor's degree in aeronautical engineering. Because of wartime demands at the time, colleges operated on a 12-month schedule, which allowed the typical 4-year programs to be completed in 2. Kraft would attempt to join the Navy during his freshman year, but he was rejected on fairly flimsy medical circumstances. With this, Kraft accepted a job at Chance Vought Industries, an aircraft development company known for the F-4U Corsair combat fighter. Kraft had also kept his options open at the time, applying to the National Advisory Committee for Astronautics, but kept this as a secondary option as it was based in Virginia, a little too close to home. It is, however, very lucky that he did. Upon arriving at Chance Vought in Connecticut, he had neglected to bring his birth certificate with him, and they refused to induct him without it. Displeased with the bureaucracy, Kraft returned to Virginia, accepting the position with the NACA instead. While not involved in production, the NACA was at the forefront of development and testing of the most cutting-edge aircraft designs, including what would become the Bell X-1, the first aircraft to successfully exceed the speed of sound. As a member of the Research and Development Division under Bob Gilruth, Kraft was involved with developing early gust alleviation systems intended to relieve stress on the aircraft traveling through turbulent air. It was during this research that Kraft had also discovered that the strongest source of aircraft wake turbulence was not propeller wash, but a phenomenon called wingtip vortices, swirls of air turbulence from the craft's wings, which at higher speeds can even manifest visually as long white trails. This phenomenon would actually be forgotten until years later, and though Kraft did enjoy the work he did, it had been extremely stressful for him, to the point that he began to develop ulcers by 1956, and even to the point where he considered retirement. But global events find very strange ways of impacting upon one's plans. That global event was, of course, Sputnik 1 in 1957, the world's first operational satellite launched by Russia. This prompted United States President Dwight D. Eisenhower to push for an acceleration of the fledgling space program. The following year, the National Aeronautics and Space Act was signed, creating a brand new organization to further develop spaceflight studies, technologies, and operations, but under civilian control and not exclusively military. In the creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, several organizations were consolidated, particularly the NACA, the Langley Research Center, and all employees involved, including Kraft. Even before the official formation of NASA, Gilruth had invited Kraft to the group that would focus primarily on putting a man into space, which Kraft did not hesitate in accepting. Kraft would find himself in the operations division of Project Mercury, the program to put the first man in space, and would even be given primary responsibility for drawing up the mission plan. This sounded simple at first, but no man had ever flown in space at the time, and everything would have to be done virtually from scratch. This put Kraft in charge of developing not only the mission plans, but complete mission timelines, flight procedures, and mission rules. And as these plans took shape, more and more questions began to arise. Questions such as how to track the spacecraft traveling around the entire globe at 7 miles per second, how to maintain communication with the astronaut inside, how to maintain the vast network of stations that would be tasked to all these responsibilities, what contingency plans would need to be put into place. And as all these questions were tackled, Kraft would quickly realize that NASA would require a central facility from which these responsibilities could be coordinated, but even more than that, at the speed at which an orbiting spacecraft is traveling, in the limited time it could remain within each communications window, There would be far too much for a single person to keep track of and assess alone. While during typical flight testing, ground support was minimal, but this was a brand new and complex venture. Kraft had looked around and seen that he was surrounded by engineers that were each experts in specific areas of the spacecraft and its flight. And during a mission, particularly in the launch phase, a steady stream of telemetry is being received, to which these experts could assess situations in real time. In this, Kraft hit upon a revolutionary new concept: flight control from the ground. This concept would manifest itself as the Mercury Control Center, and Kraft would be the most instrumental voice in organizing this new facility. But something just wasn't fitting. A full room of voices all chattering instructions to the astronaut would only complicate matters. Kraft knew that someone had to be in charge of the flights as they were actually going on, and he wanted to be that person. Kraft himself would be the birth of the flight director. Each flight controller provides inputs, and he makes the decisions, informing the capsule communicator, or Capcom, of what information needed to be relayed to the astronaut in flight. From this position, Kraft would serve through the entire Mercury program, as well as mentor the flight directors that would follow. Names like John Hodge, Glenn Lunny, Jerry Griffin, and Gene Kranz. Gene was serving as an assistant flight director during America's first orbital flight, Mercury Atlas 6, callsign Friendship 7, with astronaut John Glenn. It was in this mission that Kraft would make a decision that would shape NASA forever. During the flight, an indicator in mission control had indicated that the landing bag was deployed. This potentially meant that the heat shield, which rested over the landing bag, was loose. Upon listening to the inputs from his flight directors and troubleshooting during flight, Kraft determined that the signal was false and chose to ignore it. Kraft's superiors in NASA management, including the Mercury capsule designer, had all felt differently, overriding his decision. They had instructed Glenn to keep the retro rocket package, which covered the heat shield, on the spacecraft during re-entry. Kraft was aghast at this idea, for any debris breaking off the retro package during re-entry could damage the heat shield, or even worse, if any of the rockets had any solid fuel remaining, it could ignite and destroy the entire vehicle. Fortunately, this did not happen. Glenn returned safely, and an investigation began on the spacecraft. As it happens, the heat shield was never loose, and the signal was triggered by a faulty indicator, just as Kraft suspected. He recognized that the flight control team knew more about the situation than anyone in management, and they were far more capable of making decisions. Kraft would make absolutely sure such overruling would never happen again, and from this point on, the flight director would have the final say in all decisions, regardless of what management has to say, or even the President of the United States. When a mission is in progress, the word of the flight director was absolute. And as Gene Kranz watched the situation unfold, he knew that this was an important evolution in the role of the flight director. Kraft would continue to serve as flight director for all 6 Mercury flights, receiving the NASA Outstanding Leadership Medal from President John F. Kennedy in a ceremony at the White House Rose Garden. As Project Gemini began, Kraft's role changed again, as missions would now last for several days rather than just a few hours. He would continue to serve as a flight director, but his new position as head of mission operations found him in charge of an entire team of flight directors. Manning mission control in 3 shift rotations was a new experience for many flight control teams, but everyone had proven capable and adaptable in this regard, especially the flight directors. Gene Kranz would recall his very first shift handoff during the flight of Gemini 4, at which point Kraft would simply say, "You're in charge," and walk out. By the time the dual flight of Gemini 7-6, Kraft had decided it was best for him to step aside from the flight director role, leaving the job to the competent and capable men whom he had trained, allowing him to devote more of his attention on the upcoming Apollo program. It was a bit tough for him no longer being the center of the action, especially during the emergency situation of Gemini 8, though he felt the flight control team had done everything properly, only that he wished he'd been the one on the spot. Here he was in 1966, wishing for the stressful position, when 10 years earlier stress had found him contemplating retirement. 1 year later, the feeling would surely return, not for Kraft, but for certainly a vast majority of the flight control team, as the young men manning the consoles would have their very first experience with death when the 3 men of Apollo 1 perished in the fire during what should have been a routine test. Kraft was set to serve as flight director for that first Apollo flight, and was therefore on hand in the role during the tragic event. Though the results of a mission were all on the shoulders of the flight director, it was recognized by all that there was nothing Kraft could do. Even Betty Grissom, wife of the widowed astronaut, knew this, and even asked Kraft to be one of the pallbearers at her husband Gus's funeral. After the events of the fire, and the eventual assurance that the Apollo program would continue, Kraft had found that his role as a manager through the mission planning would force him to step aside from the flight director's duties, and he reluctantly agreed. Perhaps it was for the best, as the flight of Apollo 7 proved troublesome. The very first time in which an astronaut was openly insubordinate to a flight director. While Wally Schirra may have had a legitimate beef, in that many aspects of the mission were changed last minute, and he suffered a nasty head cold during the mission, it was still far beyond any semblance of acceptable behavior. The overall mission was a success, but Kraft, having watched all of this, would confer with Chief Astronaut Deke Slayton that none of the Apollo 7 crew would ever fly in space again. Through 1968, Kraft's position within Mission Control became that of an observer. Though he was instrumental in mission planning for the chain of Apollo events that would follow, he was not in any direct control during these historic moments. Viewing from the observation gallery during the moment when Apollo 11 reached the lunar surface, right alongside Bob Gilruth, the 2 men reflecting in just how far they had come in these short 10 years. Kraft now serving as Deputy Director of the Manned Spacecraft Center, and by 1972 he would take the mantle from Gilruth, from whom he had served under for his entire career. And everyone who served under Kraft had felt he was the most worthy successor that the Space Center had ever had. Though eligible to retire in 1980, he elected to remain in his management role until finally retiring in April of 1982. Some had suspected that his retirement announcement was perpetuated by the rumor that Johnson Space Center was losing primary control over shuttle flights and the upcoming space station plans, but he continues to deny it. After his retirement, Kraft offered his services as a consultant to such companies as Rockwell International and IBM, even offering his services back to NASA on occasion for several space shuttle review boards. In an attempt to streamline costs, a report drafted in 1995 called the Kraft Report had decreed that the space shuttle was as operational and reliable as technology would allow. Many criticized this report for installing a false sense of safety and security within NASA, and some even stating that it could have indirectly contributed to the complacency regarding the investigation of the foam strike that led to the fatal breakup of the shuttle Columbia. Though it would be unfair to blame Kraft for this directly, as it was only one of many management faults involved. In 2011, the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, had officially renamed its Mission Control Center to the Christopher C. Kraft Jr. Mission Control Center in honor of the man whom had shaped its very existence from day one. The man who started it all, continuing on through the age of 91 at the time of this broadcast, having witnessed everything from the first unmanned flight of Mercury to the first unmanned test flight of the new Orion. Hopefully, he'll still be with us on the day when Orion returns America to the moon. RadiOdyssey and Cymax Media wish a happy birthday to Christopher Columbus Kraft Jr. His incredible contributions and legacy will forever mark this week in space history.